Spring in Riverland never arrived quietly. The Coober River, winding its slow silver path along the town's edge, always broke its banks by March. But in 2018, the rains didn't stop. They came in long, unbroken sheets, drumming against roofs and turning the fields into lakes. The townspeople watched nervously as the river swelled higher with each passing day, until one night, without warning, it surged beyond anything they had seen in decades. The water rose like a beast waking from sleep, swallowing basements, crawling over driveways, flooding the old quarter near the dam where the houses leaned wearily on cracked foundations. On the far edge of Riverland, in a crumbling house where the shingles peeled back like old bark, lived Emma, a woman whose hair was the color of ash and whose steps had grown slower with the years. Her companion was a young puppy she had found months earlier, left in a soggy cardboard box on her porch. She had named him Teddy. He was small, all awkward limbs and a messy coat of white and rusty patches, with thick, alert ears and eyes too wise for his age. When the flood came, Emma was sleeping. The first warning was a rumble beneath the floor, not loud, but deep, a pressure that shifted the air. The water had already pushed into the crawl space, saturating the earth, pressing against the old beams. In the dark, under the weight of the rising water, part of the floor gave way with a sudden, splintering crack. Teddy fell through. The drop wasn't far, but it was enough. He tumbled into the half-submerged basement, landing in shallow, icy water. Dazed but unhurt, he scrambled to his paws, only to find the broken floorboards arching above him, trapping him like a box. A narrow gap near the base of the wall let in a trickle of air, but no way out. Emma woke at the sound. For a moment she thought it was the wind, but when she put her feet to the floor and felt the chill of standing water seep into her slippers, she knew something was wrong. She rushed outside, heart hammering against her ribs, and saw her yard transformed into a river. The rain fell in thick, blinding sheets, the yard light swallowed by mist. The world had been erased. She called Teddy's name, over and over, her voice breaking against the storm. No answer, no shape darting from the shadows to her feet. She stumbled back inside, calling again, searching the rooms, her hands shaking. It was only when she paused, straining to hear beyond the storm's roar, that she caught it, a faint, desperate yip, muffled and thin, rising from beneath the house. Teddy was there, trapped, alone. And the water kept rising. Teddy was trapped. The water continued to rise, slow but relentless, first brushing his paws, then soaking into his belly. The cold seeped through his thin fur, turning each breath into a shallow shiver. But he did not whimper. He did not howl. Instead, he called out, sharp, urgent yelps, spaced carefully, as if some instinct, deeper than fear, told him to conserve his strength but not his hope. Between the cracks of warped floorboards, his voice climbed upward, threading through the flooded air, into the roar of the rain. Each bark was a flare in the darkness, a signal tossed into a world too vast and loud to notice a single life. He would fall silent at times, the pauses long enough for doubt to creep in. But then, another bark, thin, strained, but there. He didn't understand why the world had gone cold and wet. He didn't understand why the warm hand and the safe floor had disappeared. He knew only that silence was defeat, and he wasn't ready for silence. Above him, Emma huddled on the sagging porch beneath a battered umbrella. The wind turned the rain sideways, stinging her face, soaking the thin jacket wrapped around her shoulders. She kept her phone gripped tightly in her hand, but the screen showed no signal, no bars, no rescue. The water was climbing the steps now. She had tried everything. She had waved down the few cars that struggled through the flooded streets before they turned back. She had called out, screamed until her throat was raw. She had left messages for the emergency services that might never be heard. They had promised help would come when the water receded, but promises meant nothing against the ticking clock of the river. Emma knew. She knew the minutes mattered more than the hours, that small bodies lost heat faster, that hope wasn't something you could put on hold. She sat there, her body trembling with cold and helplessness, listening. Sometimes, through the roaring wind and the crackle of branches torn from trees, she heard it, a soft, broken yip floating up from beneath her feet. He was still there, still fighting, still calling for someone to answer. By morning, the floodwaters had slackened but not retreated. They hung heavy across the town like a second sky, a great mirror that reflected the pale, exhausted light of a washed-out dawn. Emma's house still stood, sagging on its fragile foundation, a stubborn island in a field of slow-moving water. Inside, the air was thick with dampness, and the creeping smell of mildew began to seep from the walls like a warning left too late. But worse than the decay was the silence. Teddy's voice was gone. No yips, no desperate scratches against the boards. Not in the gray light of morning. Not as the hours dragged into a slow, heavy afternoon. Emma sat on the porch wrapped in a sodden blanket, her hands tucked under her arms, rocking slightly without realizing it. Her eyes flickered at every small ripple on the water's surface, every groan of the shifting house. Her heart hammered with every false sound, with every nothing. The worst fear wasn't the flood. It was that she might have missed his last cry. All she could do was wait and listen. Wait and hope against the silence that settled deeper with every minute. The sun sank, barely a smudge behind the clouds. The light dimmed to a soft, ash-colored dusk. Then, when she had almost stopped believing she would hear anything at all, it came. A sound. So faint, she thought she had imagined it. A single, ragged bark, strained and hoarse like wind catching in a broken reed. Then another, weaker still, but real. Teddy was alive. Somewhere beneath the soaked wood and rising rot, he still fought. He still called. Emma pressed her hand to her mouth as tears blurred her vision, not from grief, but from the fragile, stubborn miracle of it. The tiny life beneath her feet, battered by cold and darkness, refused to be quiet, refused to disappear. In the vast, indifferent world, his voice rose again, thin and trembling. But there, he was still asking to be found. On the second day, when the rescue team finally arrived, the floodwaters still clung stubbornly to the earth, thick and glinting under a tired sky. Emma met them barefoot, her hair plastered to her scalp by rain, her voice no more than a rasp scraped raw from shouting into the storm. Two men in heavy jackets and waterproof boots stepped cautiously through the mud. One was older, methodical, already scanning the damaged house with weary eyes. The other was younger, Josh, with a rough voice that barked orders efficiently, but eyes so soft they seemed at odds with everything else about him. Josh listened when Emma pointed toward the broken floor. He didn't waste time asking unnecessary questions. He grabbed a crowbar and knelt in the puddled entryway, his breath misting in the damp air. The older man brought a bucket, and together they worked, prying up rotten planks, bailing out pockets of standing water, peeling back the house piece by piece. Underneath, near a cracked support beam, they found him. Teddy lay, pressed against the foundation wall, half submerged, soaked to the bone. His fur clung to his small frame in heavy mats, his body shivering in shallow, jerky spasms. He didn't move when the light fell on him. Only his eyes opened, wide, glassy, exhausted, but still alive. Josh crouched low, one hand extended slowly like approaching a wild thing. But Teddy didn't fight. He didn't shrink away. When Josh lifted him, cradling his sodden weight carefully against his chest, the little dog let out a tiny, broken whimper, more relief than pain, and then fell silent again. Emma ran to them, her hands trembling so badly she could hardly steady the blanket they wrapped around him. She climbed into the back seat of the rescue truck with Teddy tucked against her chest, whispering words that dissolved into the fabric of the wet blanket, words he might not hear but surely knew. Teddy shivered the entire ride to the veterinary clinic, his small body barely producing enough warmth to fight back the chill. His breathing was shallow but steady, his heart beating fast but stubborn. He was alive. He was broken and battered and soaked through with the flood, but somehow, against the odds, he was still here. The veterinarian delivered the verdict with careful, measured words. Hypothermia, the beginnings of pneumonia, but he still had a chance. Teddy was frail, but his heart was strong. And that was something not every patient carried with them through the door. They left him at the clinic under warm lights and soft towels. Emma returned to the little house alone, clutching the soaked blanket he had been wrapped in. The next morning she washed it, dried it by the stove, and brought it back to the clinic, laying it across her knees as she sat in the waiting room. She stayed for hours, silent, watching the comings and goings of strangers, but seeing none of them. Teddy's world had shrunk to the small metal space of his kennel. In the beginning, he barely moved, his tiny body curled tight, his breaths shallow and uncertain. His eyes stayed open, following every movement through the glass like a silent question. Emma sat where he could see her. Hours turned into a rhythm. Each day she returned, her hands cradling the old blanket, her presence soft and steady. On the second day, Teddy sniffed at the food placed near his paws. Weakly, almost absently, he took a bite. It was a small thing, but Emma caught it, the moment his will sparked again. By evening, he shifted his body closer to the bars, reaching toward the warmth just beyond them. On the third morning, when the vet opened the kennel door, Teddy did something no one expected. He stepped forward, not fast, not with the clumsy enthusiasm of a healthy puppy, but carefully, one paw at a time, his legs wobbling, his muscles stiff from disuse. He crossed the gap between himself and Emma without a sound, pressing his damp nose against her trembling hand. She didn't cry. She simply scooped him up, the blanket already waiting, and held him close as if anchoring him to the world. When they returned to the battered house, Emma didn't speak. She laid a new, clean blanket by the stove where the warmth still pulsed gently into the air. She opened a window just enough to let the spring breeze carry away the heavy scent of flood and fear. On the table, she placed a small tag she had ordered, Teddy's name etched neatly into it, polished and shining. He wasn't just rescued. He belonged. In the house where walls still bore the stains of the storm, there was now a heartbeat. A voice, small but steady, returned to the silence. By the spring of 2019, Riverland had installed a new early warning system and river monitoring network, a promise that what had happened would not be allowed to happen so easily again. On the day they unveiled it, the town gathered by the refurbished levee under banners and speeches, the scent of damp earth still clinging to the air. Emma stood among them, holding Teddy in her arms. He had grown. No longer the shivering bundle that fought against the flood, he was now lean, with a coat that gleamed under the shy spring sun. But his eyes had not changed. They still held that same steady, knowing weight, as if somewhere deep inside he remembered every heartbeat of that night. A local journalist snapped their photo. It appeared the next morning in the Riverland Gazette beneath the headline, "The Puppy Who Never Fell Silent." People stopped Emma in the street, bent down to stroke Teddy's head, told her he was brave, a little miracle. She only smiled softly, knowing the truth was simpler. Down the street, Nate, a boy from the neighboring house, spoke shyly to a group gathered around the new flood sensors. He said that Teddy had taught him something no adult ever quite managed to explain, not to be afraid to call for help, because when Teddy called, someone answered. That was all it had taken. In a world that too often drowned out small voices, Teddy's had risen up through rain and wreckage, through darkness and fear. Not to demand, not to command, just to be heard. Maybe that, after all, was the real heart of survival. Not the strength to endure alone, but the courage to call out when you could not. Teddy was never a hero in the grand shining way that stories like to tell. He was just a voice, small and stubborn, refusing to disappear. And in that, he became everything.